The plane was ready for takeoff. Passengers settling into their seats. The hum of first-class luxury wrapping around them like an invisible shield. Malik Coleman sat in seat 3B. Shoulders squared, heart steady, ticket in hand. He had earned this. He belonged here. But then, "Excuse me, young man." A voice, sharp, clipped, cold. "Ms. Whitaker." The flight attendant with years of experience and unquestioned authority stood over him. Her eyes flickered to his face. Then to the seat. Then back again. "I don't think this is your seat." It wasn't a question. It was a decision. In that moment, the cabin itself seemed to hold its breath. The other passengers heard. They saw. And yet, they said nothing. They simply watched as Malik, who had done nothing wrong, was asked to move. But what Ms. Whitaker didn't know, what no one on that plane knew, was that Malik wasn't just any passenger. He was the son of Jordan Coleman, the man who owned the airline. And by the time this flight landed, she would regret ever opening her mouth. Because silence is never just silence. It is a choice. And the question is, where does quiet injustice come from? Comment below. Have you ever witnessed something unfair in public and stayed silent? Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that make you think. Now let's begin. The air inside the plane was cool, crisp, sterile, the kind of carefully conditioned environment meant to make passengers forget where they were. But Malik felt everything. The hum of the engines vibrating beneath his feet. The scent of leather seats mixed with the faint tang of recycled air. The murmurs of well-dressed passengers in first class, barely glancing up from their devices as they settled in. He belonged here. He knew he did. His father had made sure of it. Malik pressed his small hands against the armrests, excitement curling in his chest. His father had promised him this trip, his first time flying alone, a reward for acing his exams. It was more than just a ticket. It was proof of his effort, his place in the world, his right to be here. His seat, 3B, was a symbol of everything he had worked for, and he was ready to enjoy every moment. He adjusted his hoodie, smoothing the soft fabric against his skin, and glanced around at the other passengers. Men in sharp suits, women in tailored dresses, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. None of them paid him any mind. He was just another traveler, another paying customer, no different from the rest. But then, a shadow fell over him. A voice, sharp, edged with something cold, cut through his moment of peace. "Excuse me, young man." Malik looked up, blinking. The flight attendant, a woman with a stiff posture and a name tag that read Ms. Whitaker, stood over him. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her expression unreadable. "Yes?" he said, his voice polite, careful. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flickered over his face, then to the ticket clutched in his hand, then back to him. A hesitation, a split second too long. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The question landed like a stone in his stomach. He sat up straighter, instinctively tightening his grip on the ticket. "Yes, ma'am, seat 3B." Ms. Whitaker didn't move. She didn't nod or check the manifest. Instead, she tilted her head, as if seeing him for the first time. Really seeing him. Her lips pressed together, a line of doubt forming between her brows. "I don't think so," she said, her voice measured, controlled. The first ripple of unease slid through him. But he held out his ticket. She took it, barely glancing at it before shaking her head. "This is a first-class seat," she said. Malik's heartbeat quickened. "I know," he said, sitting up even straighter. "That's what my ticket says." She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, waiting, letting the moment stretch long enough for the passengers around them to take notice. Heads turned, subtle shifts in posture, the flicker of glances over the tops of newspapers and phone screens. But no one spoke. No one asked why she was questioning a child who had already shown her his ticket. No one interrupted to say, "Let him be. He's where he's supposed to be." No one did anything at all. Malik swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how small he was in this space. He had never been here before. In a moment like this, where the truth, the simple, undeniable truth, wasn't enough. "Where are your parents?" Ms. Whitaker asked. His stomach tightened. "I'm traveling alone," he said, his voice quieter now. Something shifted in her posture. A flicker of something she tried to mask. Surprise? Disbelief? Disapproval? "I see." But she didn't see. She didn't see him. She handed the ticket back to him, already shaking her head. "Unfortunately, there must have been a mistake." This seat is reserved for first-class passengers only. And just like that, his world tilted. I am a first-class passenger, he said, his voice firm but not loud. This is my seat. She smiled then, but it wasn't warm. It was tight, forced, like a mask she had worn many times before. I think there's been some confusion, she said. You need to take your things and move to economy. The hush in the cabin deepened. The businessman beside him shifted in his seat, pretending to be absorbed in his newspaper. A woman a few rows ahead adjusted her sunglasses, sneaking a glance but saying nothing. Still, no one spoke. No one defended him. The heat rose in his face, crawling up his neck. His fingers curled into his lap. But this is my seat, he said again, softer this time. Ms. Whitaker sighed, her patience thinning. Sir, she said, voice clipped, I'm asking you nicely. You need to move. And in that moment, Malik understood something he had never fully grasped before. It wasn't about the ticket. It wasn't about a mistake in the system. It was about him. About what he looked like. About what she thought when she saw him sitting here, alone, in first class, where she had not expected him to be. His chest felt tight, the weight of the silence from the passengers around him, the quiet judgment, the assumption unspoken but heavy pressed down on him. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached for his backpack. His legs felt unsteady as he stood, stepping into the aisle. Ms. Whitaker didn't offer to help. She simply turned, motioning toward the back of the plane. Right this way. As he walked past the rows of first-class seats, past the people who had seen everything but chosen to say nothing, he kept his eyes forward. He would not let them see his face. He would not let them see how much this moment hurt. He reached the economy section, sat down in a smaller, cramped seat, his grip tightening on the armrests. The air felt different here, tighter. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he typed. They made me move to the back. Said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket. She didn't believe me. He hesitated for just a moment before pressing send. The response came almost instantly. What do you mean they made you move? Who made you move? His father's words were short, sharp, not panicked, but focused. Malik hesitated, then replied, the flight attendant. She said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen. This time, the response took longer. 5 seconds. 10. The dots blinking on the screen. Then, what's the flight number? Malik exhaled slowly, checking his boarding pass. He typed it out and hit send. The reply came almost instantly. Stay where you are. I'll handle it. And for the first time since Ms. Whitaker had towered over him, questioning his right to be there, Malik felt something shift. This wasn't over. Not even close. The seat in economy was too tight, too stiff. The air around him felt different, heavier, charged with something unseen but felt. Something that settled deep in his bones. Malik sat still, back pressed against the worn-out cushion. His fingers curled tightly around the edges of his phone. His father's last message, stay where you are. I'll handle it, was still glowing on the screen. But it did nothing to ease the heat creeping up his neck, the weight pressing against his chest. The murmurs in the first-class cabin had followed him like whispers through the curtain. He could still feel them, those careful, polite glances, the ones that barely lasted a second, yet carried more judgment than words ever could. They had seen what happened. They had watched him be dismissed, told to move, and no one, not one person, had spoken up. That was the part that lingered. The silence. It stretched beyond this moment, beyond this plane, beyond this one instance of humiliation. Malik knew this silence. He had felt it before, sensed it in classrooms where his intelligence was questioned before he had the chance to speak. In stores where watchful eyes followed his every move as if waiting for him to prove them right. And now, here it was again, wrapping itself around him in this pressurized cabin, in this economy seat where he had been placed. He let out a slow breath, steadying himself, forcing his hands to unclench. He would not let them see how much this moment had cut him. He would not break, not here. A flight attendant passed by. A different one, a younger woman with soft eyes and hesitant steps. She glanced at him as if she wanted to say something. But then her gaze flickered past him, toward the first-class curtain. And she kept walking. That was the thing about silence. It wasn't just an absence of words. It was a choice. Malik swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth. He needed to focus. He had sent the message. His father knew. That was enough. Except, it wasn't. Because she was still up there. Ms. Whitaker. She had turned away from him without a second thought, without so much as checking the system, without a moment of hesitation. Her voice, polite but laced with quiet certainty, had told him everything. You do not belong here. And she had believed it. More than that, she had expected everyone else to believe it too. And they had. The curtain at the front of economy fluttered as someone stepped through. Malik didn't look up at first. Not until the movement stopped beside him. Sir. The voice, calm, measured, practiced, was hers. Malik lifted his gaze, meeting her eyes. She was crouching slightly, lowering herself just enough to seem polite, but not enough to suggest she was actually sorry. There's been a misunderstanding, she said, carefully. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat. Malik didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak, because something in her voice didn't sound right. A few passengers shifted in their seats, the air around them thick with curiosity. They had seen him moved once. Now they were watching as the same flight attendant came to undo what had been done. But Malik knew better. This wasn't about making things right. This was about who had called. This was about who was watching now. And that was why she had come back. A misunderstanding? Malik echoed, his voice quiet but sharp. Ms. Whitaker hesitated just for a fraction of a second. But he caught it. Yes, she said quickly, her hands smoothing down the front of her uniform. There was an error in seating. Malik tilted his head, studying her. But I had my ticket. Her throat bobbed. Yes, but. And you saw it. Another pause. Her expression remained composed, but her fingers twitched where they rested on her lap. I may have misjudged. You didn't check anyone else's ticket, Malik said. Just mine. The murmur around them grew louder. Passengers shifting, some glancing at one another. Even the ones who had ignored the first interaction were paying attention now. Because their silence was being broken. Ms. Whitaker's posture stiffened. Sir, she said, voice clipped, strained. Please come with me. Malik held her gaze a moment longer. Then, slowly, he picked up his backpack and stood. The walk back to first class was different this time. Not a walk of shame. Not a retreat. Something else. Passengers turned as he passed. Some eyes flickering away in embarrassment. Others meeting his with something that almost resembled guilt. Almost. He reached his seat, sat down, adjusted his hoodie, placing his bag neatly beside him. Ms. Whitaker lingered. If there's anything you need, she murmured. Malik opened his book, flipped a page. She stood there, awkward, before turning stiffly and walking away. But it wasn't over. Not yet. A moment later, her work tablet vibrated. She hesitated before pulling it from her pocket. A new message, forwarded from the airline's executive office. She read it. Her fingers tightened around the device. Take your time. Make her understand what she did. The blood drained from her face. She turned, looking back toward the boy in seat 3B. He was already watching her. Calm, unshaken, unmoved. And that, she realized, was what terrified her the most. The first-class cabin had returned to its quiet hum. But Malik knew the silence was different now. It was charged, not the comfortable, indifferent silence it had been before. But something heavier, something uneasy. He could feel it in the way passengers avoided his gaze. In the way their eyes flickered toward Ms. Whitaker when she moved through the aisle. In the stiffness of the flight attendants who had seen what happened but still went about their duties as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Ms. Whitaker knew it too. She stood at the front of the cabin, her back to him, fingers gripping the edge of her work tablet. Malik watched her shoulders rise, hold, then fall with a breath she didn't want anyone to see. She was unraveling. Not completely, not yet, but enough that the realization was sinking in. Enough that she was beginning to understand the gravity of what she had done. Enough that she was beginning to fear the consequences. Malik didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to. His father had taught him long ago that power wasn't always in the words you said. Sometimes, it was in the silence. And right now, his silence was speaking louder than anything else. The in-flight phone rang. A sharp, clipped sound that sliced through the cabin's quiet. Ms. Whitaker flinched. She turned slowly, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way toward the galley, where the phone sat mounted on the wall. She hesitated before picking it up. This is Whitaker. A beat of silence. Then, her back straightened. Yes, Captain, she said, voice strained. A pause. Her fingers curled tighter around the receiver. Understood. She hung up, turning back toward the cabin, her face pale. Passengers pretended not to watch. But they were. Everyone was. She squared her shoulders and walked back through the aisle. Every step measured, every movement stiff with forced composure. She stopped in front of Malik's seat. "Sir," she said, voice quieter this time, "the captain would like to speak with you." Malik didn't react. He simply closed his book, set it neatly on the tray table, and rose from his seat. This time, when he walked through first class, he wasn't being led away. This time, he was walking toward something. Toward accountability. Toward justice. Toward reckoning. The cockpit door was open when he reached it, and the captain, an older man with graying hair and sharp, assessing eyes, stood waiting. "Mr. Coleman," the captain greeted, his voice steady. Malik's stomach clenched at the name. Not young man. Not kid. Not sir. He had called him Mr. Coleman. And that meant he knew. Malik stepped inside. The cockpit was smaller than he had imagined, filled with the soft glow of control panels and the quiet hum of radio chatter. On the screen, staring at him through a live video feed, was his father, Jordan Coleman, CEO of the airline. Malik exhaled slowly, centering himself. "Malik," his father said, his voice as steady as ever. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Malik said. His father studied him for a moment. "What happened?" Malik didn't hesitate. "She told me I didn't belong," he said. "She didn't check the system. She didn't verify my ticket. She saw me sitting there, and she decided without proof, without question, that I didn't belong." The captain inhaled sharply through his nose. His father's expression didn't change. "And the other passengers?" Malik's jaw tightened. "They watched," he said. His father's lips pressed into a thin line. He already knew the answer. Because this wasn't the first time. Not for Malik. Not for him. Not for any black man. No matter how much money he had. No matter how much power he carried. The name Coleman might have bought them seats in first class. It might have built an empire. But it had never been enough to make them immune. "Where is she now?" his father asked. The captain glanced toward the cabin. "She's still on duty," he said. "Good," his father said. A pause. "She'll be staying there until we land," he continued. "And when we do, she will explain herself to the executive board." The words weren't loud. They weren't sharp. But they were final. Irrefutable. Malik's chest loosened. Just a fraction. "In the meantime," his father said, his voice quieter now, "I want you to sit back down in your seat. Order whatever you want. Enjoy the rest of your flight." Malik nodded once. "And, Malik?" He looked up. "Hold your head up," his father said. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Malik swallowed. "I know." His father nodded. The video feed clicking off. The cockpit was silent for a moment. Then the captain turned to him. "Let's get you back to your seat, Mr. Coleman." And this time, when Malik walked through first class, the silence wasn't just heavy. It was deafening. Ms. Whitaker stood at the galley, her face pale, her fingers shaking where they gripped the counter. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't dare. Malik took his seat. A flight attendant approached moments later, her voice softer than before. "Would you like something to drink?" Malik considered her for a moment. "Sparkling water," he said. She nodded quickly, disappearing down the aisle. And just like that, the flight continued. The passengers resumed their conversations. The attendants carried on with their duties. And yet, nothing felt the same, because everyone in that cabin knew what had just happened. They knew what had been done. And more importantly, they knew who had seen it. Malik leaned back in his seat, feeling the quiet power settle in his bones. For the first time since stepping onto this plane, he felt what Ms. Whitaker had tried so hard to deny him. Belonging. The cabin had returned to its routine. But there was a tension in the air. A shift that could not be undone. The passengers in first class, who had once sat in practiced comfort, now seemed restless in their silence. Some crossed their legs more than necessary. Others adjusted their reading glasses, though they had no intention of returning to their books. A few scrolled mindlessly on their phones, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to feel the weight of what had happened. Ms. Whitaker was moving, but her movements were different now. Not the sharp, confident steps of a woman in control, but the hesitant, measured steps of someone trying desperately to regain balance on shifting ground. She was doing what she had always done, offering drinks, collecting napkins, refilling glasses, but it was no longer effortless. She could feel eyes on her now. She could feel the question hanging in the air. Why did she do it? No one asked it aloud. But they didn't need to. It was there, pressing against her like the recycled air in the cabin. Thick and inescapable. She reached the galley and gripped the counter. Exhaling slowly. Her hands were trembling, just slightly. She flexed her fingers, willing the sensation away. This was just a misunderstanding. That's all. A simple mistake. Then why did it feel like the floor beneath her was no longer solid? The in-flight phone rang. She flinched. The other flight attendants exchanged glances. Their expressions unreadable. None of them reached for the phone. It wasn't their call to take. Ms. Whitaker swallowed hard and picked it up. This is Whitaker. Ms. Whitaker. The voice was deep, calm, and absolute. It was Jordan Coleman. She gripped the phone tighter. Yes, sir. When this flight lands, his voice was measured, controlled. You will remain on the aircraft. You will be escorted to a meeting with the airline's executive board, where you will explain why you removed my son from his seat without verifying his ticket. Her breath caught in her throat. Sir, this is not a discussion. Silence. The kind that burns. The line went dead. Ms. Whitaker slowly lowered the receiver. Her fingers numb. For years, she had walked through airports with confidence, wearing her uniform like armor. She had prided herself on her ability to manage a cabin, to maintain order, to handle passengers as she saw fit. But now, for the first time, she was the one being handled. She turned, catching the eye of Nicole, the younger flight attendant who had witnessed it all. Nicole didn't say anything. She just watched. And that, somehow, was worse. Malik sat still, but inside, he was burning. The injustice of it sat heavy in his chest, a weight pressing down with each breath. He had spent his entire life learning how to carry moments like this, how to swallow them down, how to keep his hands steady even when his mind was screaming. But today, something was different. Today, he didn't have to carry it alone. His father had made sure of that. Malik reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to type something, anything, but what could he say? They watched. No one said anything. She didn't even check. He exhaled slowly. He knew his father was handling it. He knew Ms. Whitaker was already unraveling under the weight of her own actions. But none of that erased the moment itself. None of that changed the fact that, for a time, she had won. She had seen him sitting there. And she had believed without hesitation that he did not belong. And she had expected the world to agree. And for a moment, they had. He clenched his jaw. His father's words echoed in his mind. Hold your head up. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Malik straightened. He lifted his chin, exhaled, and pressed send. We're landing soon. The reply came seconds later. Good. Sit tight. She's going to learn something today. Ms. Whitaker felt the shift before she heard it. The passengers were moving differently now, adjusting their postures, stealing glances in her direction. The hush in the cabin wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was charged. She turned and froze. Malik was looking at her. For the first time since she had told him to move, he was looking at her. Really looking. And it was not the look she had expected. It was not anger, not defiance. It was knowing. A quiet, steady knowing that made her stomach twist. Because he had already won. Because she had already lost. Because now everyone knew. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright position. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Ms. Whitaker inhaled sharply. The flight was ending, but her reckoning had only just begun. The wheels touched down with a dull, controlled jolt, and for the first time since this flight began, Ms. Whitaker felt the full weight of gravity. She had spent her entire career mastering composure. She had learned how to smooth over disputes with a manufactured smile. How to silence questions with a practiced, even tone. She had worn authority like a second skin. But now, her uniform felt tight, suffocating. Her hands were clammy against the drink tray she hadn't realized she was still gripping. She had been called to the cockpit. She had been told, in no uncertain terms, that when this plane landed, she would not simply walk away. The cabin was stirring to life. Passengers reached for their belongings, stretching stiff limbs, speaking in quiet voices that masked the hum of curiosity. But beneath the normalcy, there was something else, a shift, an understanding that they had all witnessed something, and that the moment was far from over. Ms. Whitaker turned her head slightly, just enough to see him. Malik, sitting there, calm, unmoved. He had been humiliated in front of these same passengers. He had been made to question himself, to feel that he did not belong. And yet he sat there as if nothing could touch him now. Because he knew. Because the moment she had forced him from his seat, she had unknowingly put herself in his place. And now, she was the one waiting to be escorted away. The seatbelt sign flicked off. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the captain turns off the fasten seatbelt sign. Passengers began their usual hurried motions, reaching for overhead bins, gathering personal items, the mechanical shuffling of people eager to escape the confines of the aircraft. Ms. Whitaker's fingers curled at her sides. She knew what was coming. And she wasn't ready. Malik watched her, but he felt nothing. No satisfaction. No triumph. Just exhaustion. Because he had seen this before. It had played out in different places. Different faces. Different tones of voice, but it was always the same. Someone with power had assumed something about him. Had seen his face, his skin, and decided without question, without even considering they could be wrong, that he did not belong. And now, here she was, standing in the same silence she had forced onto him. The irony of it sat heavy in the air between them. A flight attendant approached him cautiously, offering a drink, as if unsure whether to acknowledge the weight of what had happened. Malik didn't respond right away. "I'll have sparkling water," he said finally. The attendant nodded, hurrying away, relieved to have something normal to do. Malik reached for his phone, glancing down at the last message from his father. "Stay seated. Do not engage. Let this play out." He exhaled slowly. It already was. Ms. Whitaker stood near the galley, waiting. She had never been on this side of waiting before. She had watched flight attendants get called in before. Usually, it was for small infractions, customer complaints, a misstep in service, a warning, a slap on the wrist. But this was different, because the man waiting for her on the other side of that jet bridge wasn't a disgruntled customer. He was the man who owned the sky she was flying in. Jordan Coleman was waiting for her. Her stomach twisted. She could already see it, her career flashing before her. Every decision she had ever made. Every moment she had prided herself on running a tight ship, on making sure the right kind of passengers felt comfortable in first class. And now, she wasn't sure if she would ever step onto another plane again. A voice crackled in her earpiece. "Ms. Whitaker, remain on board after deplaning. Security will escort you." Her knees locked. The finality in those words. Security. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to straighten. She could feel Nicole's gaze on her, but she refused to meet it. The young flight attendant had seen everything, had heard everything, and yet, she had done nothing, because that was how it always went, wasn't it? People saw, people heard, but silence was easier. The door to the aircraft opened. Passengers began filing out, stretching their legs, eager to step onto solid ground. Malik waited. His father's instructions sat firm in his mind. Stay seated. So he did. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply waited. And when the last passenger left, when the first-class cabin was finally empty except for the crew, he looked up. Ms. Whitaker was still there. Still waiting. And in the doorway, standing just beyond the jet bridge, was a uniformed officer. Her breath caught. She turned slightly, just enough to see Malik looking at her. Not with anger, not with gloating, but with expectation. Because he knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. The air beyond the jet bridge was thick. Oppressive. Not from the heat, nor from the enclosed space, but from something more intangible, something heavier. It was the weight of a moment stretching, bending, before it inevitably broke. Ms. Whitaker felt it pressing down on her chest, tightening with every breath, with every step she was forced to take. She was aware of everything now in a way she hadn't been before. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor. The way her uniform, once a symbol of authority, of control, now felt too tight. Constricting. She wasn't walking toward a debriefing. She was walking toward judgment. The uniformed officer led her down a private corridor, away from the usual flow of disembarking passengers, away from the sanitized normalcy of the airport terminal. There was no small talk, no reassurance, just silence. And that silence said everything. Her heart pounded as they reached a door. It slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a conference room that was too bright, too sterile, too exposing. Inside, 3 executives sat at a polished table, their faces unreadable, and at the far end of the room, in front of a sleek, high-definition screen, was him, Jordan Coleman, the owner of the airline, the father of the boy she had humiliated. Ms. Whitaker swallowed hard, her hands clenching at her sides. He didn't speak right away. Didn't acknowledge her discomfort. Didn't need to. His silence was heavier than anything in the room. And then finally he leaned forward. Fingers interlocked. His expression calm. "Ms. Whitaker," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a greeting. It was a statement. A summons. She forced herself to stand straighter. "Sir," she said, voice thin, "you know why you're here." A flicker of something in her chest, fear, shame, defensiveness. There was a misunderstanding. She started. "No," he interrupted. The single word cut through the room like a blade. "Cold. Absolute." She pressed her lips together. "It was a misjudgment." Then, she amended, her voice quieter. He tilted his head, considering her. "A misjudgment," he echoed. He let the word sit there. Waited, before speaking again. "Tell me, Ms. Whitaker, when you first saw my son sitting in first class, what did you think?" Her stomach twisted. "Sir, I was simply following protocol. That's not what I asked." His voice was still measured, still composed, but it left no room for escape. "I asked," he continued, "what you thought." Her mouth went dry. Because the truth was dangerous. The truth was something she had spent years never having to say aloud. She had looked at the boy. And she had thought, he doesn't belong here. Not because of his clothes. Not because of his behavior. But because of what he was. And now, she was being asked to name it. Her silence stretched too long. One of the executives shifted in his chair, sighing through his nose. "Let me be clear, Ms. Whitaker," Jordan Coleman said, his fingers tapping just once against the table. "This isn't just about my son. This is about every person who has ever been in his position. Every person who has been made to feel that their place is something they must prove, rather than something they are entitled to." His voice was quiet, but it rang louder than anything else in the room. "So, again, I ask you, what did you think?" Ms. Whitaker exhaled shakily. Her hands were trembling. She had spent years controlling cabins, controlling passengers, controlling order. But this was beyond her control. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever she said next would decide everything. Her career, her future, her legacy. She wet her lips, forcing herself to meet his gaze. And then, finally she answered. "I didn't think he belonged," she said. The words were small, almost fragile, but the truth of them was enormous. And in the silence that followed, there was no misunderstanding left. No misjudgment to hide behind. No escape. Just the weight of what had been done. What had always been done. Jordan Coleman sat back in his chair. The room was silent. And then, he spoke. "Thank you for your honesty." Ms. Whitaker exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But what came next? That would be the true reckoning. Ms. Whitaker had spoken the words. Had let them fall from her lips like broken glass. Sharp and irreversible. "I didn't think he belonged." The truth had been wrenched from her. And now it sat there. Between them, like a wound laid bare. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control of the moment. She had always been the authority. The one who enforced the unspoken rules. Who made decisions without question. Who dictated the order of things. But now, sitting in this room beneath the harsh, unforgiving lights, she was the one being judged. And she had no defense. Jordan Coleman regarded her for a long time. His face was unreadable, his fingers steepled in front of him, his eyes sharp, deliberate. He did not speak, and his silence was not merciful. It was the kind that pressed against a person, that made them feel the weight of their own choices. Ms. Whitaker had once believed that silence was her ally, that if she didn't acknowledge what she had done, if she simply moved forward, the moment would pass. But she understood now this silence was different. This was the silence of a verdict being considered. This was the silence of consequences waiting. One of the executives cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, his voice clipped. "What do you believe should happen now?" Her breath caught. What was she supposed to say? That she was sorry? That she had never meant for this to happen? That she had not intended for this moment to be about race? That she had simply been following an instinct she had never questioned? Would any of that matter? Would it undo the fact that a child had been humiliated in front of an entire cabin of passengers? Would it erase the way he had been forced to move? The way no one had spoken for him? The way she had believed without a second thought that her assumption was truth? No, nothing would change that. She swallowed, staring down at her hands, at the skin of her knuckles turning white as she clenched them in her lap. I don't know, she said, her voice hoarse. Jordan Coleman let out a slow, measured breath. That, he said, is the problem, Ms. Whitaker. She looked up sharply, something in his tone sending a chill through her spine. You don't know. You have spent years making decisions about people deciding who should sit where. Who deserves what kind of service? Who is worthy of respect? And now, when faced with the cost of that power, you don't know what should happen to you. She flinched. Because he was right. Because for years, she had been so certain. She had never hesitated when moving passengers who looked like they were in the wrong seat. She had never second-guessed the rules she enforced. Because in her world, there had never been a cost for being wrong. Until now. This isn't just about my son. Jordan continued. This is about every black child. Every black passenger who has been made to feel that they must prove their presence is valid. That they must endure humiliation in silence. Because the alternative, the confrontation, is too dangerous. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You didn't just remove my son from his seat. Ms. Whitaker, you removed his dignity. You reinforced an unspoken truth that people like you have built your comfort on, that people like him do not belong. The words landed like stones in her chest. She wanted to speak, to deny it, to say that wasn't what she meant. But she had already spoken the truth. She had thought he didn't belong. And there was no taking it back. The silence in the room stretched again, suffocating. Then, finally, one of the executives shifted in his chair. Effective immediately. Ms. Whitaker, you are suspended from duty pending further review, he said, his voice neutral, as if reading a weather report. Your employment status will be reviewed by the board within the next 72 hours. Her body went still. If you choose to resign before that review, the airline will accept your resignation and close this matter. She understood what they were offering. A chance to leave before she was pushed out. A chance to avoid the stain of an official termination. A chance to slip into the same silence that had once protected her. But that silence wasn't hers anymore. She had seen the way Malik had looked at her when he passed her in the aisle. Not with anger, not with hatred, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had always known how the world worked. She had expected him to shrink under the weight of her assumption. Instead, she had been the one to crumble. She inhaled sharply. I understand, she said, barely above a whisper. The meeting was over. She had lost. And for the first time, she knew she had deserved to. Malik sat in the back of the car, watching the city blur past the window. His father was on the phone. His voice calm, composed, handling things. He always handled things. But Malik wasn't thinking about the board meeting, or about Ms. Whitaker, or about what would happen next. He was thinking about the moment she had looked at him. The moment she had seen him. Really seen him. Not as a passenger. Not as a seat number. But as something more. Something undeniable. She had wanted him to disappear. But he hadn't. He was still here. And she was the one who had been made to move. He turned back to the window. Exhaling. For the first time since boarding that plane. The weight in his chest felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. Because today, silence had lost. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. The airport was alive with its usual chaos, people rushing to catch flights. Flight attendants hurrying through terminals. The monotone drone of announcements spilling from overhead speakers. Travelers wheeled their suitcases over polished floors. Their faces indifferent to the moments that had unraveled inside that plane. But inside her, something had shifted. Ms. Whitaker sat alone in the break room, staring at the coffee in her hands. It had long since gone cold. But she hadn't moved. Her mind kept returning to the boy's face. Malik. The way he had looked at her, not with rage. Not with the kind of indignant fury she had been bracing for. But with something worse. Disappointment. A quiet, known kind of disappointment that had settled in his expression like a weight he had been carrying long before she ever told him to move. Because he had known. He had known before she had even spoken that this was always a possibility. He had known, Because boys like him, men like him had been here before. And that knowledge, that deep-rooted expectation of how the world would treat him, had been far more damning than anything she had said aloud. She exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temples. She should have been angry. At the board, at Mr. Coleman, at the way her career was crumbling beneath her. But the longer she sat here, the more she realized, she wasn't angry at them. She was angry at herself. Because for years, she had believed she was fair, that she had enforced rules, not bias, that she had simply been doing her job. But now, she couldn't hide from the truth. She had never questioned her own instincts. And today, that failure had cost her everything. Malik sat across from his father in the hotel suite, his fingers tracing absent patterns into the table. The city sprawled beyond the window, its lights stretching into the distance. But his mind was still in that cabin, in that seat. "Are you all right?" his father asked. Malik hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. Because what did it mean to be all right? The moment was over. He had returned to his seat. The flight had landed. Ms. Whitaker had faced her consequences. And yet, the weight of what had happened still sat in his chest. "She looked at me," he murmured, almost to himself. "She saw me, and she assumed I didn't belong." His father exhaled slowly, setting down his glass. "Son," he said, his voice steady, "there are people in this world who will always look at you and assume you are in the wrong place. Assume you don't deserve what you've earned. Assume you are less." His gaze was heavy with a truth Malik already knew. But hearing it aloud made it sharper, more defined. "And when that happens," his father continued, "you have two choices. You can let it make you small, or you can make damn sure they remember that you were there." Malik let the words settle. He thought of how he had sat in that economy seat, how he had gripped the armrests, how he had swallowed the weight of humiliation. And he thought of how he had walked back to first class. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with dignity. And that, more than anything, was what had left an impact. Not his father's power, not the board's decision, not even Ms. Whitaker's forced apology. It was the simple, undeniable fact that he had not broken. "She won't forget this," Malik murmured. His father nodded. "No," he said, "she won't." And neither would he. Ms. Whitaker stood outside the terminal, the wind cool against her face. She had made her choice. She had submitted her resignation. She had thought about fighting it, about arguing that it had been a misunderstanding, that she had been following protocol, that she hadn't meant to make that boy feel unwelcome. But the truth was, it didn't matter what she meant. It mattered what she did. She had spent years believing she was right, that she was good at her job, that her instincts were fair. But today, she had learned the cost of instincts left unchecked. Today, she had learned that her silence, her assumptions, her unwillingness to question herself had led her to this moment. And for the first time, she truly understood. This wasn't just about one mistake. This was about the thousands of moments before it, the ones she hadn't even realized. The passengers she had treated differently without noticing. The ones she had never second-guessed, simply because they looked like they belonged. The ones she had looked at and assumed without a second thought that they were wrong. She turned, staring out at the planes lined up in the distance. She had spent her entire life in the sky. But today, for the first time, she understood what it meant to fall. She inhaled sharply, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the exit. She didn't know what came next. But she knew one thing for certain. She could never go back to who she had been before. And maybe that was the beginning of something better. Malik stood at the window, watching the night settle over the city. The day was over. The flight was over. But he knew this moment would not disappear. Not for him. Not for Ms. Whitaker. Not for anyone who had been watching. It would linger, an echo in the back of people's minds. A lesson, a reminder. And maybe, that was enough. He turned away from the glass, his reflection disappearing into the dark. Tomorrow, the world would move on. But today, silence had been broken.